what if I told you that the prayers you whisper for the dead do not vanish into silence, that they do not dissolve into memory, that they do not remain trapped in the past, but instead move with terrifying gentleness through eternity, reaching souls at the exact moment they need love most? Because Padre Pio saw this with his own eyes, and it shattered forever the way he understood death, prayer, and responsibility. For Padre Pio, death was never a wall, never a final door slammed shut, never an ending that severed love. It was a thin veil, trembling, permeable, alive, and prayer was the hand that passed straight through it. He warned that the greatest tragedy of the modern soul is not disbelief in heaven or hell, but forgetfulness of the dead, because when the living stop praying, the dead do not stop longing. Padre Pio said that if the living truly understood what happens when a single prayer is offered for a departed soul, churches would never be empty and rosaries would never leave human hands. He described prayer for the dead not as a gesture of remembrance, but as an act of rescue, not as comfort for the living, but as oxygen for the souls who can no longer help themselves. One evening in San Giovanni Rotondo, long after the church had emptied and the candles burned low, a friar noticed Padre Pio, still kneeling before the altar, utterly still, as if rooted to the stone floor, his lips moving with almost imperceptible urgency. Minutes passed, then an hour, and when Padre Pio finally stood, his face was wet with tears that did not come from sorrow, but from awe. When asked what had happened, he answered quietly that something beautiful had taken place, that a soul had crossed into paradise, freed not by its own strength, not by its own prayers, but by the whispered rosary of a daughter who had no idea how close her father was to heaven. Padre Pio said that moment revealed a law of love written into eternity itself. The dead depend on the living, and the living are never powerless after death touches their family. He explained that souls in purification exist in a state of burning hope, not despair, not punishment, but longing so intense it feels like fire, a longing to be fully capable of loving God without shadow or residue of self. They see heaven, he said, but cannot yet endure its brightness, and our prayers soften that light, making it bearable, making it reachable. Padre Pio described prayer as light with weight, light that presses gently but irresistibly against the soul, lifting it, strengthening it, shortening the path it must walk. He said the souls feel prayers physically, not as words but as warmth, as relief, as air that suddenly becomes easier to breathe. Many nights, he said, souls appeared to him during prayer, not screaming, not terrifying, but humble and restrained, asking only one thing: remember me. He insisted that God allows these encounters not to frighten the living, but to awaken responsibility, because the dead are not strangers, they are members of the same body, the same family of love. Padre Pio once spoke of a monk who had died centuries earlier in the same monastery, still waiting because no one had remembered him with sufficient prayer, and when Mass was finally offered for that forgotten soul, Padre Pio said heaven opened quietly, and the monk passed into light, without drama, without noise, because love does not announce itself, it completes its work silently. He taught that purgatory is not God's cruelty but God's mercy, not a sentence but a surgery, removing the final attachments that would make heaven unbearable. And this is why prayer for the dead is not optional charity, but an extension of justice, because love, unfinished on earth, must be completed somewhere, and God invites us to participate in that completion. Padre Pio said, every Mass offered for the dead becomes like a torch thrown into darkness, and the souls gather around it instinctively, drawing close to its warmth, strengthened by its glow, carried forward by a love that remembers them by name. He also warned that neglecting the dead does not harm God, but it impoverishes the living, because prayer for the departed purifies the heart of the one who prays, teaching selflessness, patience, and trust in the invisible. He called it the highest form of charity because it expects nothing in return, no thanks, no recognition, no visible reward, only faith that love travels farther than sight. Yet he insisted that nothing offered in love is ever lost, that the souls helped by prayer become powerful intercessors, friends for eternity, protectors who pray with intensity once they reach heaven. He said the circulation of grace is real, that what you give returns multiplied, and that the prayers you offer for the dead today may be the very prayers that save you tomorrow. Padre Pio lived with the constant awareness that the dead are close, nearer than we imagine, walking beside us, watching us forget them, waiting not for tears but for prayer. He said that when we pray for them, time bends, because God stands outside of time, and love offered today can be applied to a soul's final moment long past. This was one of his most mysterious teachings, that prayer is not limited by chronology, that mercy moves backward and forward, touching the soul at the exact point where it can be received. Padre Pio insisted that no soul dies untouched by love, because God ensures that every soul is offered grace, and our prayers often become the vehicle of that offer. He said, when you pray for the dead, you enter the tenderness of God himself, participating in his patience, his memory, his refusal to abandon anyone. This is why he prayed constantly for those who died alone, forgotten, unclaimed, because love, he said, searches even for those no one names. For Padre Pio, praying for the dead was not an occasional devotion, but a way of breathing, a rhythm woven into every hour of the day, because wherever love exists, there is no true distance between the living and the dead, only a veil thin enough for prayer to pass through. Padre Pio went even deeper into this mystery when he explained that the souls who depend most on our prayers are often not the ones we remember naturally, not only parents, spouses, or children, but the forgotten, the unnamed, the souls who died without ceremony, without legacy, without anyone left on earth to speak their name. And he said this is where prayer becomes most powerful, because it becomes pure charity, with no emotional attachment, no personal comfort, only love offered because love is right. He taught that these souls experience a particular kind of loneliness, not the loneliness of abandonment by God, but the loneliness of being unseen by the living, and that every time someone prays for all the forgotten souls, heaven responds with a tenderness that surpasses human understanding. Padre Pio said that God's mercy is especially drawn to prayers that mirror his own heart, and God never forgets a single soul. He described moments during prayer when he sensed a sudden crowd around him, an invisible gathering, souls drawn by even a brief intention offered for those who had no one. He said their gratitude was not emotional in the human sense, but radiant, quiet, and overwhelming, like light pressing gently against the soul. This is why he urged people never to limit their prayers only to those they loved in life, but to widen their heart until it resembled God's, embracing even those they never knew. He once told a friar that a single Our Father prayed for forgotten souls can release more grace than hours of distracted prayer focused only on oneself, because self-forgetting love aligns perfectly with divine mercy. Padre Pio also explained that prayer for the dead does not only shorten purification, it strengthens the soul's desire, and desire is everything in eternity. The souls in purification do not suffer because God withholds love, he said, but because they long to love perfectly and are not yet able. Our prayers do not remove God's justice, they accelerate love's readiness. He compared it to a child who wants to run into a blazing fire of warmth, but must be strengthened first, and our prayer becomes the strength placed into their legs. He insisted that this desire is intensified by love offered on their behalf, and that many souls advance rapidly when someone prays with sincerity, even if the prayer is simple and poorly formed. He rejected the idea that prayer must be eloquent to be effective, saying that heaven responds to intention, not vocabulary. This is why he reassured people who felt unworthy, distracted, or weak in prayer, telling them that the dead do not need perfection, they need presence. He said even distracted prayer carries weight if the heart remains oriented toward love. Padre Pio spoke often about the Mass as the most powerful prayer for the dead, not because of the priest, but because it is Christ himself who intercedes. He said that when Mass is offered for a soul, time collapses, heaven bends low, and Christ presents his sacrifice directly to that soul as healing fire. He described moments during Mass when he perceived movement in the invisible world, like doors opening silently, like chains loosening without noise. He insisted that one Mass offered with intention can accomplish what years of neglect delayed. Yet he also warned that the living often underestimate their responsibility because modern culture hides death, distracts from eternity, and teaches people to move on quickly instead of loving faithfully. He said, "Forgetting the dead is not emotional health, but spiritual poverty. Love does not forget, it transforms." Padre Pio believed that the dead remain connected to us through love, and that this bond is not broken by time, distance, or decay. He taught that grief becomes holy when it is converted into prayer, because prayer gives grief direction, purpose, and fruit. Without prayer, grief stagnates and turns inward. With prayer, it becomes a gift offered outward. He once told a grieving mother that tears without prayer exhaust the heart, but tears turned into prayer lift both the living and the dead. He emphasized that prayer for the dead should not be rushed or mechanical, but neither should it be avoided out of fear of pain, because love grows by being exercised, not avoided. He described how souls sometimes appeared to him not in suffering, but in anticipation, waiting for a prayer they sensed was coming, as if hope itself had become a presence. He said this anticipation is itself a grace, and that the souls often know when someone is about to pray for them, even before the words are spoken. This awareness, he said, comes from love's intelligence, which operates beyond human logic. Padre Pio also insisted that prayer for the dead purifies the living in hidden ways, softening pride, weakening attachment to comfort, and reminding the soul of its own dependence on mercy. He believed that people who regularly pray for the dead develop a gentleness that cannot be taught, because they live with the awareness that everyone they meet is fragile, temporary, and beloved by God. He warned that forgetting the dead leads to forgetting eternity, and forgetting eternity leads to living as if this world were permanent, which hardens the heart. He often said that the souls in purification teach the living how to love rightly, because they no longer love for reward, but for completion. They no longer desire recognition, only union. Our prayers, he said, join us to that desire and reshape our priorities quietly. Padre Pio lived with one foot in eternity, and this made his compassion both fierce and tender. He prayed for soldiers who died far from home, for sinners who died suddenly, for those who died without last rites, insisting that God's mercy is not constrained by human timing. He said that God ensures every soul encounters truth and love at death, and our prayers often determine how that encounter is received. This is why he urged people never to assume that a soul is beyond help. He said despair is never from God, and prayer is never wasted. Even when we do not see the result, something always shifts. He explained that heaven records every prayer not as a number, but as a movement of love, and that these movements accumulate until a soul is ready to cross fully into light. Padre Pio concluded that praying for the dead is not about controlling outcomes, but about participating in God's patience, entering his rhythm, trusting his timing. He believed that those who pray for the dead learn to wait without anxiety, to hope without demand, to love without ownership. And in that learning, he said, the living themselves are slowly prepared for heaven, because heaven is not entered by achievement, but by love that knows how to give without seeing. Padre Pio also revealed something that unsettled many who heard him speak about prayer for the dead, because he insisted that the greatest obstacle to helping the departed is not lack of faith, but distraction, the quiet erosion of attention caused by a life filled with noise, urgency, and self-concern. He said that souls in purification are especially sensitive to the quality of prayer, not in terms of perfection, but in terms of presence, because prayer offered mechanically reaches them weakly, while prayer offered with even a brief moment of genuine recollection arrives with strength. He warned that modern souls often pray while half absent, their lips moving while their hearts remain elsewhere, and that this fractures the flow of love that prayer is meant to carry. Yet he was careful not to burden people with guilt, explaining that even imperfect prayer is valuable, but that intentional pauses, moments of silence, and conscious offering amplify its power enormously. He taught that when you pray for the dead, you should imagine placing the soul directly into the hands of God, not analyzing their sins, not questioning their fate, but entrusting them completely, because judgment belongs to God alone, and love is our only task. Padre Pio said that curiosity about who is saved or lost damages prayer, because it shifts focus from mercy to control. True prayer for the dead, he said, is surrender of outcomes, trusting that God knows exactly what the soul needs. He described how souls sometimes appeared to him carrying the weight of unfinished attachments, not crimes but habits of impatience, pride, resentment, subtle selfishness that clung like dust, and how prayer gently loosened these attachments, not instantly, but steadily. He emphasized that purification is not humiliation but healing, and that souls long for it even when it burns, because only purified love can endure the fullness of God. Padre Pio also explained that the dead are not passive recipients of prayer, but conscious participants in a mystery of love. They know when they are being helped, he said, and they respond with gratitude that deepens their own surrender. He described this gratitude as active, not emotional, a strengthening of desire that accelerates their movement toward God. He once compared it to a person climbing a steep path who suddenly feels hands supporting them from behind. The climb remains, but the strength increases. This, he said, is what prayer does. He also warned against the modern tendency to replace prayer for the dead with vague positivity or sentimental remembrance. He said, memory without prayer is incomplete, because memory looks backward while prayer reaches forward. He insisted that lighting candles, speaking fond words, or celebrating a life has value only when it is joined to intercession, because only prayer crosses the veil. Padre Pio taught that the dead do not need nostalgia, they need mercy. He also addressed the fear some people carry, the fear that praying for the dead might disturb them or interfere with God's will. He called this fear a misunderstanding of love, explaining that prayer never disturbs what God has ordained, it cooperates with it. He said, God desires our participation, not because he is lacking, but because love invites relationship. The dead are not harmed by prayer, they are sustained by it. Padre Pio further revealed that prayer for the dead is deeply connected to humility, because it forces the living to confront their own future purification. He said that anyone who prays sincerely for souls in purification is already acknowledging that they too will one day need mercy, patience, and help. This acknowledgement softens judgment of others and weakens the illusion of self-sufficiency. He believed this is why prayer for the dead quietly heals divisions among the living, because it places everyone on the same ground before God. He often reminded people that purgatory exists because God takes love seriously, not because he delights in suffering. He said that if God did not purify love, heaven would not be heaven. And our prayers, he explained, are threads woven into that purification by God's own design. Padre Pio also spoke about the particular power of offering small sacrifices for the dead, not dramatic penances, but ordinary acts accepted patiently, moments of silence, acts of forgiveness, endurance of inconvenience. He said that these sacrifices carry extraordinary weight because they resemble Christ's own offering, quiet, hidden, and freely chosen. He taught that when you consciously offer a difficulty for the dead, the soul receives it as relief, because love offered through suffering speaks the same language they are learning in purification. He cautioned, however, against turning sacrifice into transaction, as if suffering could purchase salvation. Love, he said, is not a currency, it is a participation. He also revealed that prayer for the dead protects the living from despair, because it keeps hope anchored beyond the visible world. People who pray for the dead, he said, are less afraid of death, not because they deny it, but because they understand it as a passage rather than an annihilation. He believed that the fear of death grows where prayer for the dead is absent, because the imagination fills the silence with terror. Prayer fills it with meaning. Padre Pio described moments when he felt the presence of many souls during communal prayer, not overwhelming, but supportive, as if the boundary between church on earth and church beyond were thinning. He said these moments were gifts, meant to remind the living that they do not pray alone, that prayer is always communal, even when spoken privately. He taught that when you pray for the dead, you join a vast current of intercession flowing through the body of Christ across centuries. This awareness, he said, should inspire reverence, not fear. Padre Pio also addressed those who worry that they pray too late, that years have passed, that they have forgotten someone for too long. He said time does not bind mercy. No prayer arrives late in God's hands. He insisted that souls are never beyond reach, while love still moves. He told a man who regretted neglecting prayers for his parents that God receives late love with the same tenderness as early love, because God sees the heart, not the calendar. Padre Pio's teaching here was clear and demanding. Pray now, not later, not when it feels convenient, not when emotion rises, but as an act of fidelity. Fidelity, he said, is more powerful than intensity. A simple prayer repeated faithfully shapes eternity more than rare bursts of passion. He lived this fidelity daily, praying for souls he would never meet, trusting that love always finds its destination. And he insisted that every soul helped through prayer strengthens the entire body of Christ, because heaven is not a private reward, but a shared fulfillment. In helping others reach it, he said, we learn how to desire it rightly ourselves. Padre Pio went further still and revealed that praying for the dead is not only an act of mercy towards souls in purification, but also a form of spiritual warfare that the living often underestimate, because every prayer offered for the departed weakens despair, interrupts isolation, and restores order in a realm where disorder once reigned. He explained that many souls suffer not because they are abandoned by God, but because they are trapped in the final consequences of choices that fragmented their capacity to love fully, and prayer acts like a steady hand, realigning what was bent, not violently, but patiently. Padre Pio insisted that this work of prayer is slow by design, because love matures gradually, and God respects the interior rhythm of each soul. He rejected the idea that God rushes purification, explaining that heaven is not a reward to be seized, but a reality to be inhabited, and only souls shaped by love can endure it without shrinking. Our prayers, he said, shape that endurance. He also taught that prayer for the dead restores balance to the living world because it anchors human life in eternity rather than urgency. When people stop praying for the departed, he warned, life becomes narrow, frantic, and anxious, as if everything depended on immediate success. But when prayer for the dead is practiced faithfully, the living begin to see their struggles differently, not as final battles, but as temporary passages. Padre Pio believed this shift was essential for spiritual health, because despair grows when eternity is forgotten. He described despair as a disease of short vision, and prayer for the dead as the medicine that extends sight beyond the grave. He once told a spiritual child that praying for the dead teaches the soul how to wait, and waiting is one of the most difficult virtues because it demands trust without control. Souls in purification, he said, are experts in waiting, and when we pray for them, we learn from them even as we help them. This mutual exchange deepens humility on both sides of the veil. Padre Pio also warned that praying for the dead should never become selective or conditional, as if only the virtuous deserved help. He said the souls who need prayer most are often the ones we would struggle to love in life, the difficult, the forgotten, the morally compromised, because love offered where it is hardest resembles Christ most closely. He insisted that praying for sinners after death is not approval of their sins, but confidence in God's mercy, and that refusing to pray for them is a subtle form of judgment that impoverishes the one who withholds prayer. He spoke bluntly, saying that anyone who refuses to pray for certain souls because they feel undeserving has not yet understood grace. Grace, he said, is always undeserved, and that is precisely why it saves. He also explained that the dead do not experience prayer as pressure or demand, but as accompaniment. They are not pushed forward by prayer, they are strengthened to walk. This distinction mattered deeply to him, because it preserved the freedom and dignity of the soul, even in purification. Padre Pio emphasized that God never treats souls as objects to be moved, but as persons to be healed. Our prayers participate in that healing, not by force, but by presence. He also taught that praying for the dead reveals hidden attachments in the living, especially attachment to outcomes, to visible results, to emotional reassurance. Prayer for the dead rarely gives immediate feedback, and this trains the soul to love without proof. He said, "This kind of love purifies the one who prays as much as the one who is prayed for." Many people, he said, want confirmation that their prayer worked, but faith matures when it learns to trust without signs. Yet he acknowledged that God sometimes grants signs to encourage perseverance, and he himself witnessed many such signs, moments when peace descended suddenly, when heaviness lifted without explanation, when prayer felt completed rather than exhausted. He called these moments quiet confirmations, not guarantees, reminding the soul that God is attentive. Padre Pio also spoke about the danger of replacing prayer for the dead with theological speculation, debates about the afterlife, or curiosity about states of souls. He said, "Curiosity distracts from charity, and charity is what moves heaven." Understanding has value, he admitted, but love has priority. He urged people to pray first and ask questions later, because prayer aligns the heart before the mind attempts explanation. He warned that intellectualizing the afterlife without praying for the dead leads to coldness, while praying without full understanding leads to holiness. He believed holiness always precedes clarity. Padre Pio also taught that prayer for the dead should be woven into ordinary life rather than isolated as a special occasion. He encouraged people to offer short prayers throughout the day, not only formal devotions, because love expressed frequently builds continuity. A brief intention offered while walking, working, or resting, he said, carries real weight if offered consciously. He rejected the idea that prayer must always be solemn or dramatic, saying that God delights in simplicity and the dead recognize sincerity immediately. He once said that a single whispered, "Lord, have mercy on the souls who wait for you," offered with awareness, can travel farther than long prayers recited without attention. He also explained that prayer for the dead protects families spiritually, because gratitude flows back through the bond of love. He said that souls helped through prayer do not forget, not in a sentimental way, but in a way that strengthens the living during moments of trial. He insisted that many protections attributed to chance or coincidence are in fact responses to prayers once offered for the dead. This circulation of grace, he said, is hidden because God prefers humility to spectacle. Padre Pio warned against treating prayer for the dead as a burden or obligation, because love forced becomes heavy and joyless. He encouraged people to approach it as companionship, as walking with those who cannot yet finish their journey alone. He said that when prayer becomes companionship, it ceases to feel heavy and begins to feel natural, like remembering a friend while traveling. He also addressed those who fear purgatory excessively, clarifying that fear distorts prayer. He said purgatory should inspire compassion, not terror, because it is already the beginning of heaven, already secure in hope. The souls there are not lost, he insisted, but saved and being prepared. Our prayers do not rescue them from damnation, but assist them toward completion. This distinction mattered to him deeply, because it preserved trust in God's goodness. Padre Pio concluded that praying for the dead is one of the clearest ways to live in communion with the Church as a living body that transcends death. When the living pray for the dead, he said, the Church breathes fully, stretching across time, uniting past, present, and future in one movement of love. And in that movement, he insisted, no prayer is small, no soul is forgotten, and no love is wasted. Padre Pio also taught that one of the most overlooked dimensions of praying for the dead is how deeply it reorders the conscience of the living, because when a person regularly intercedes for souls who can no longer act for themselves, the soul begins to measure life not by success or comfort, but by fidelity, responsibility, and love that extends beyond death. He said that praying for the departed forces the living to confront a truth modern culture avoids, that life is brief, accountability is real, and love is the only thing that survives the grave. This confrontation, he insisted, is not meant to produce fear, but clarity. Clarity strips away illusions. Padre Pio believed that many people live distracted not because they are evil, but because they have lost sight of eternity. And prayer for the dead restores that sight quietly, steadily, without drama. He said that when someone prays for the departed consistently, their choices begin to change, almost without noticing. Their priorities soften, their judgments lose sharpness, and their attachment to superficial concerns weakens. This is because the soul begins to live with an awareness that everything done in love echoes beyond time. Padre Pio also warned that ignoring the dead contributes to a false sense of autonomy, as if each life were isolated, self-contained, and answerable only to itself. Prayer for the dead shatters this illusion by revealing that human lives are bound together in a network of responsibility that does not dissolve at death. He said this awareness is humbling because it reveals how much we depend on one another, how little we save ourselves alone. He believed that this humility is one of the greatest graces prayer for the dead produces. He also spoke about the interior resistance people often feel when beginning to pray for the departed, a resistance born not of unbelief but of discomfort with silence, waiting, and lack of visible response. He said, many abandon the practice too quickly because they expect emotional consolation or immediate signs, not realizing that prayer for the dead works precisely by emptying the soul of the need for feedback. This emptiness, he said, is fertile ground for faith. Padre Pio insisted that prayer becomes most powerful when it is stripped of emotional dependency and offered as a free act of love. He compared it to planting seeds in soil you will never see again, trusting that growth occurs beyond your sight. He also addressed those who feel overwhelmed by the number of souls who need prayer, fearing they can never do enough. He reassured them that God does not measure prayer by quantity, but by fidelity. A small number of prayers offered consistently over time, he said, forms a river that carries souls forward steadily. He urged people not to attempt to carry the weight of the entire world, but to offer what they can with constancy. Constancy, he said, is the signature of authentic love. Padre Pio also explained that prayer for the dead teaches patience in a world obsessed with speed. Souls in purification move according to a rhythm that cannot be rushed, and when we pray for them, we learn to respect that rhythm rather than impose our own urgency. This respect, he believed, heals the living from anxiety and impatience. He said impatience often masquerades as zeal, but true zeal waits without resentment. Prayer for the dead trains the soul to wait with hope rather than agitation. He also spoke about how this practice deepens trust in God's justice because it requires the living to surrender outcomes completely. We do not see the purification, we do not calculate its duration, we do not judge its necessity, we simply love and trust. Padre Pio believed that this surrender purifies the living from the need to control, which he saw as one of the root causes of spiritual suffering. He also taught that prayer for the dead strengthens family bonds across generations, even when relationships were strained or broken in life. He said prayer can heal what conversations never resolved, because prayer speaks where words failed. He encouraged people to pray especially for relatives with whom they had unresolved tension, not as an attempt to fix the past, but as an act of mercy that releases both sides from resentment. He believed that many hidden healings occur in families when someone chooses to pray for a departed relative without conditions. He also explained that prayer for the dead has a purifying effect on memory itself. Memories often trap people in regret, anger, or idealization, but prayer transforms memory into offering. When memory becomes offering, it no longer imprisons the heart. Padre Pio insisted that this transformation is essential for spiritual freedom. He also spoke about the particular power of praying the rosary for the dead, because the mysteries place the soul's purification within the life of Christ himself. He said that when a rosary is prayed for a departed soul, the soul is led through the mysteries of Christ's suffering, death, and resurrection in a way that strengthens hope and accelerates readiness for glory. He believed the rosary teaches the soul how to pass from sorrow to joy, from purification to union. He also encouraged offering small daily prayers for the dead rather than reserving prayer only for anniversaries or funerals, because love expressed daily builds continuity. He warned that limiting prayer for the dead to special occasions risks turning it into ritual rather than relationship. Relationship, he said, is sustained by regular presence. Padre Pio also addressed the misconception that praying for the dead distracts from caring for the living. He rejected this entirely, saying that prayer expands the heart rather than dividing it. Those who pray for the dead, he said, become more attentive to the living because they see each person as eternal. He believed this vision produces gentleness and patience in daily interactions. He also spoke about the way prayer for the dead purifies one's own approach to death. People who pray regularly for the departed, he said, fear death less, not because they trivialize it, but because they understand it as a transition accompanied by love. He believed this understanding is essential for dying well. He often reminded people that the way one lives determines the way one dies, and the way one prays for the dead shapes the way one will be prayed for. He encouraged people to live in such a way that others would naturally pray for them, not out of obligation, but out of love. Padre Pio also taught that God sometimes allows the living to feel dryness or heaviness when praying for the dead, not as punishment, but as participation. This participation, he said, unites the living with the souls they pray for, sharing in their waiting. He believed this shared waiting deepens compassion and purifies intention. He cautioned against abandoning prayer during these dry periods, because perseverance during dryness carries particular weight. He said, God often uses dryness to detach the soul from consolation and root it more firmly in love. Padre Pio concluded that prayer for the dead is one of the most effective schools of holiness available to ordinary people, because it requires no special gifts, no extraordinary experiences, only fidelity, humility, and love. In praying for those who cannot repay us, he said, we learn to love as God loves, freely, patiently, and without condition. And in learning that love, he believed, the living are quietly prepared for the day when they too will depend entirely on the prayers of others. Padre Pio also revealed that one of the most misunderstood truths about praying for the dead is that it places the living directly inside the mystery of divine mercy, not as observers, but as collaborators. Because when you pray for a soul that can no longer change its own destiny, you are participating in God's patience, God's tenderness, and God's justice all at once. He said, this is why the act is so powerful, and also why it is so demanding, because it strips away the illusion that salvation is a private affair. In his view, every soul is carried forward not only by its own choices, but also by the love that surrounds it, and prayer for the dead is the purest form of that surrounding love. Padre Pio explained that many people struggle with this teaching because it confronts modern ideas of independence and self-sufficiency, but heaven, he said, is built on interdependence, not autonomy. No one arrives alone. He often spoke about how the souls in purification experience time differently, not as hours and days, but as intensity of longing. And when prayers are offered for them, that longing is eased, not because their purification is bypassed, but because hope is strengthened. Hope, he said, is the true fuel of purification. Without hope, purification would be unbearable. With hope, it becomes a path rather than a prison. He also described how some souls respond immediately to prayer, while others require long perseverance, not because God is withholding mercy, but because each soul carries different wounds, attachments, and depths of purification. He cautioned the living not to compare or judge, reminding them that God's work in souls is hidden and precise. Padre Pio emphasized that one of the greatest acts of trust is to continue praying for a soul even when nothing seems to change, because this persistence mirrors God's own faithfulness. He said, "God never abandons a soul halfway, and neither should we." He also revealed that the prayers of children carry a unique light for the dead, not because children are innocent in a sentimental sense, but because their love is undivided. He encouraged families to teach children to pray for deceased relatives, explaining that these simple prayers often pierce purification more gently and effectively than complex formulas. He once said that a child's prayer is like a candle placed directly in the darkness, small but unmistakable. Padre Pio also spoke about the importance of intention when praying for the dead. He warned against praying mechanically or out of obligation alone, because prayer offered without presence lacks warmth. He did not mean that distracted prayer is useless, but that intentional prayer multiplies grace. He advised people to pause briefly before praying for the dead and consciously place the soul in God's hands, even if only for a moment. That moment of awareness, he said, aligns the heart with heaven. He also explained that praying for the dead has a cleansing effect on one's own conscience, because it gently exposes areas of unresolved guilt, regret, or attachment that often remain hidden. This exposure is not meant to accuse, but to invite healing. He believed that many people resist praying for the dead because it awakens memories they would rather avoid. But he insisted that these memories are doorways, not traps. When offered to God, they lose their power to wound. Padre Pio also taught that prayer for the dead corrects a dangerous distortion of faith, the belief that God's justice is harsh or impersonal. By praying for souls undergoing purification, the living witness justice infused with mercy, purification sustained by love. He said this balanced vision protects believers from both despair and presumption. He also warned that neglecting prayer for the dead often coincides with a loss of reverence for life itself, because when eternity fades from view, life becomes disposable. Prayer for the dead restores gravity to existence, reminding the living that every action, word, and omission carries weight beyond the moment. He explained that this awareness does not suffocate joy, but purifies it. Joy becomes deeper when it is anchored in meaning. Padre Pio also spoke about the connection between suffering and prayer for the dead. He said that when someone offers personal suffering, illness, disappointment, or loneliness for a departed soul, the offering carries exceptional strength because it unites love with sacrifice. He did not glorify suffering, but he recognized its redemptive potential when freely offered. He encouraged people not to waste suffering, but to transform it into intercession. He believed that many souls are freed through offerings that no one else ever sees. He also emphasized that praying for the dead is a remedy for loneliness because it expands the soul's sense of belonging. Those who pray for the departed, he said, are never truly alone because they live in communion with the living and the dead. This communion, he insisted, is real, not symbolic. He described it as a living network of love that spans heaven, earth, and purification. He also warned against reducing prayer for the dead to fear-driven motivation, such as praying only to avoid punishment or to secure favors. He insisted that authentic prayer flows from love, not anxiety. Love alone sustains perseverance. He also explained that praying for the dead refines one's understanding of forgiveness. Forgiveness for the dead, he said, is often deeper than forgiveness for the living because it cannot be negotiated or confirmed. It is offered freely without response. This makes it purer. He believed that unresolved resentments often dissolve when a person prays sincerely for a deceased person who hurt them. He said this prayer releases both souls, the one who prays and the one prayed for. Padre Pio also revealed that many people underestimate the cumulative effect of prayer over time. He compared prayer to water dripping onto stone, seemingly insignificant at first, but transformative through persistence. He urged people not to underestimate daily prayer, even brief prayers, because consistency forms pathways of grace. He also spoke about the importance of remembering forgotten souls, those with no one to pray for them. He said, these souls often respond with particular gratitude and intercession. He encouraged people to include unnamed souls in their prayers, trusting that God would direct the grace where it was most needed. He also warned that a society that forgets its dead eventually forgets its soul. Remembering the dead, he said, anchors humanity in humility and continuity. Padre Pio concluded that praying for the dead is not an optional devotion, but a vital expression of love that shapes the moral and spiritual health of the living. He believed that those who neglect this practice lose sensitivity to grace, while those who embrace it grow in compassion, patience, and faith. In his view, prayer for the dead is one of the quiet forces that hold the world together, unseen, uncelebrated, but indispensable, because it keeps love moving where time can no longer reach. Padre Pio also taught that praying for the dead gradually reshapes the inner landscape of the soul in a way few other spiritual practices can, because it forces a person to live with one foot in time and one foot in eternity, aware that every breath belongs to God and every relationship carries consequences beyond the grave. He said that people who persevere in this prayer begin to sense life as something sacred and fragile, not to be exploited or rushed through, but to be lived attentively. This attentiveness, he explained, is the opposite of spiritual sleep. Many souls, he warned, are not lost through hatred of God, but through distraction, through a life lived on the surface, untouched by depth. Prayer for the dead pulls the soul downward into depth, into silence, into reflection. It reminds the living that one day they too will depend entirely on mercy, not achievement. Padre Pio believed this awareness is one of the greatest protections against pride, because it places everyone on equal ground before God. No one carries their titles, successes, or reputation into eternity, only the truth of who they became. He often said that praying for the dead strips away illusions gently, without humiliating the soul, because it teaches humility through compassion rather than fear. He also explained that this practice forms a spiritual memory within the heart, a memory that keeps eternity present even during ordinary tasks. Washing dishes, walking to work, caring for children, all of these actions, he said, take on a different weight when done by someone who regularly prays for souls awaiting heaven. Life stops feeling random. Everything becomes part of a larger offering. He also spoke about how prayer for the dead trains the soul to love without control. You cannot manage the outcome. You cannot measure progress. You cannot demand results. You simply give. This, he said, is the purest form of love and the hardest for modern people to learn. He warned that many abandon prayer for the dead precisely because it gives no immediate reward, but he insisted that this hiddenness is what makes it precious in God's eyes. God, he said, treasures what is done without witnesses. He also revealed that souls in purification are acutely aware of prayers offered for them, not as words, but as warmth, relief, and strength. He described it as if a heavy atmosphere suddenly becomes breathable. This relief, he said, does not remove purification, but makes it bearable. He compared it to someone carrying a heavy load who suddenly feels another hand helping to lift it. Padre Pio emphasized that this help does not violate justice, because justice itself is fulfilled through love. Love, he said, never contradicts justice. It completes it. He also taught that prayer for the dead sharpens the conscience of the living because it awakens sensitivity to sin, not as rule-breaking, but as rupture of relationship. When a person regularly intercedes for the departed, they begin to recognize sin as something that damages love rather than merely violating law. This recognition, he said, produces genuine repentance rather than scrupulosity. It softens the heart instead of hardening it. He also warned that neglecting prayer for the dead often coincides with a loss of reverence for suffering. People begin to see suffering as meaningless, something to escape at all costs, rather than something that can be offered and transformed. Prayer for the dead restores meaning to suffering by linking it to love beyond oneself. He said that when suffering is united with intercession, it becomes creative rather than destructive. He also spoke about how prayer for the dead protects families from generational spiritual numbness. When children see parents praying for deceased relatives, they learn that love does not end with death and that faith is not limited to visible outcomes. This transmission, he believed, is essential for preserving faith across generations. He warned that a faith that does not include the dead gradually becomes shallow because it forgets its roots. He also addressed the fear some people have that praying for the dead will intensify grief. He said the opposite is true. While it may awaken sorrow initially, it ultimately transforms grief into purpose. Grief becomes an offering rather than a wound. He believed that unexpressed grief often turns inward and becomes bitterness, while grief offered through prayer becomes compassion. He also explained that prayer for the dead creates spiritual resilience because it trains the soul to endure longing without despair. Souls in purification live in longing, and when we pray for them, we learn to live with our own longings without becoming resentful. This, he said, is a crucial lesson for spiritual maturity. He also taught that praying for the dead refines hope, because it anchors hope in God rather than in outcomes we can control. Hope becomes patient rather than anxious. He believed this patience spills over into daily life, reducing agitation, comparison, and frustration. He also revealed that many people misunderstand heaven and purgatory because they imagine them as distant places rather than states of relationship. Prayer for the dead corrects this misunderstanding by emphasizing connection rather than distance. He said the dead are not far away, they are simply beyond our senses. This closeness, he believed, should inspire tenderness rather than fear. He also emphasized that prayer for the dead teaches reverence for silence. Many prayers for the departed are offered quietly, without words, sometimes only as presence. He believed these silent prayers often carry great weight because they mirror the stillness of purification itself. He encouraged people not to be afraid of silence when praying for the dead, because God speaks most clearly there. He also spoke about the temptation to quantify prayer, counting rosaries or masses as if grace could be calculated. He cautioned against this mindset, saying that while numbers can help discipline, love cannot be measured. One prayer offered with total surrender, he said, can outweigh many offered mechanically. He also revealed that the souls who benefit from prayer often become intercessors for the living in subtle but powerful ways. He said many unexplained protections, inspirations, and moments of consolation come from souls who were once helped through prayer. This mutual exchange, he said, is part of the communion of saints, a living reality rather than a doctrine. He also warned that a world that forgets to pray for the dead risks becoming spiritually amnesic, cut off from its own history and destiny. Prayer for the dead, he said, keeps humanity grounded in humility, reminding us that we are part of a story larger than ourselves. He concluded that those who persevere in this prayer become guardians of hope, quietly holding open the door between time and eternity. They may never see the full effect of their prayers on earth, but heaven, he said, remembers every act of love offered for a soul that could not ask for itself, and in that remembrance nothing is ever lost. Padre Pio concluded his teachings on praying for the dead with a truth that he carried like a wound in his own heart, a truth he believed heaven wanted the world to remember before it forgot how to love beyond what is visible. He said that praying for the dead is not primarily about changing their fate, but about allowing God to change us into people capable of eternal love. In his eyes, this prayer reveals whether a soul truly believes in the communion of saints or only speaks about it. Many profess belief, he said, but live as if death ends responsibility, ends relationship, ends charity. Prayer for the dead exposes this contradiction gently but unmistakably. It forces the living to admit that love either reaches beyond the grave or it is not love at all. Padre Pio believed this realization is one of the final purifications God offers the living before death, an invitation to expand the heart beyond comfort, reward, and reciprocity. He often said that the greatest danger of modern faith is not disbelief, but limitation, loving only what can be seen, helped, or thanked in return. Prayer for the dead breaks this limitation because it is love poured into silence, love offered where no human gratitude can respond. He believed God treasures this kind of love more than any visible devotion because it mirrors God's own way of loving humanity long before it could respond. He also taught that those who pray faithfully for the dead are slowly freed from fear of judgment, not because judgment disappears, but because love grows stronger than fear. Fear focuses on punishment, love focuses on union. Prayer for the dead trains the soul to desire union more than reward. He said this desire is the beginning of heaven within the heart. Padre Pio also warned that neglecting this prayer leads to a subtle hardening, a shrinking of compassion that eventually affects how one treats the living. When the dead are forgotten, he said, the living are soon reduced to usefulness, productivity, or agreement. Prayer for the dead keeps compassion alive, even when people can no longer contribute, agree, or respond. He believed this compassion is the true measure of a Christian soul. He also spoke about the moment of death with unusual clarity. He said that when a soul leaves the body, it is surrounded not only by angels, but by the memory of every act of love offered for it. Prayers become like familiar voices calling the soul forward. He believed that those who prayed for others during life would not face death alone, because love they had sown would return to accompany them. This was not poetic imagery to him, but something he said he had witnessed repeatedly. He described dying souls who were strengthened by prayers offered decades earlier, prayers the living had forgotten but heaven had preserved. He insisted that no prayer offered in love ever expires. God stores them outside of time, releasing them when they are most needed. This belief shaped how Padre Pio lived his final years. As his body weakened, his intercession intensified. He prayed not only for those he knew, but for those forgotten by history, unnamed, unloved, unremembered. He said these souls often responded with the greatest gratitude because no one else had remembered them. He believed that remembering the forgotten is one of the highest forms of charity. He also revealed that praying for the dead prepares the soul for its own purification by loosening attachments gradually rather than violently. Souls who live without this prayer, he said, often cling desperately to life, possessions, or identity at death, making purification more painful. Those who have learned to let go through intercession pass more gently because they have practiced surrender. He also spoke about how prayer for the dead corrects a distorted understanding of salvation. Salvation, he insisted, is not a private escape, but an entrance into communion. Those who desire heaven without desiring communion misunderstand heaven itself. Prayer for the dead teaches the soul to long for others to arrive with us, not behind us. He said heaven is not complete until all are gathered, and those who pray for the dead participate in that gathering. He also addressed those who feel unworthy to pray for the dead, burdened by their own sins or struggles. He reassured them that prayer for the dead does not require holiness, only humility. In fact, he said, sinners who pray for other sinners often pray with greater sincerity because they understand dependence on mercy. He believed God listens attentively to such prayers because they rise from shared need rather than superiority. He also cautioned against spiritual pride in this devotion, reminding people that prayer for the dead is not a badge of piety, but an act of service. It should never become a way to feel spiritually superior, because the moment it does, its power diminishes. Love ceases to flow when pride enters. Padre Pio also taught that prayer for the dead helps heal the wound of separation that death leaves in the living. He did not deny grief, but he insisted that prayer transforms grief from paralysis into movement. Instead of endlessly asking why, the soul begins to ask how it can love now. This shift, he said, does not erase sorrow, but gives it direction. Sorrow becomes a bridge rather than a wall. He believed this is why prayer for the dead is essential for emotional as well as spiritual health. He also spoke about the way God sometimes allows the living to sense peace, warmth, or consolation after praying for the dead, not as proof, but as encouragement. These consolations, he warned, should never be sought or expected, because the real work happens in faith. Consolation is a gift, not a guarantee. He believed God gives it sparingly to keep the soul focused on love rather than experience. He also reminded people that the most powerful prayer for the dead is the Mass, because it unites intercession directly with Christ's sacrifice. He urged people not to underestimate the impact of even one Mass offered with intention. He believed the Eucharist reaches places nothing else can reach, because it carries the presence of Christ himself. He often said that when Mass is offered for the dead, heaven bends close to earth. In his final reflections, Padre Pio returned again and again to one simple conviction, that love is stronger than death, stronger than time, stronger than forgetting. Prayer for the dead, he said, is the proof of that conviction lived rather than spoken. It is love refusing to accept separation as final. It is faith insisting that relationship does not end at the grave. He believed that those who practice this prayer faithfully become quiet witnesses to eternity in a world obsessed with the present. They may never be celebrated, never noticed, but they participate in one of the most intimate works of God. He ended his teaching with a warning and a promise. The warning was this: do not wait until death touches your life to remember the dead, because love practiced too late becomes regret. And the promise was this: every prayer you offer for a soul that cannot ask for itself will one day stand beside you as testimony that you loved beyond what was visible. Padre Pio believed that at the final judgment, God will not ask how many prayers we recited, but how many hearts we carried when they could no longer carry themselves. And he was certain of this: those who prayed for the dead will never arrive in eternity alone. What if the smallest prayer you whisper without thinking carries more weight in heaven than years of carefully planned devotional prayer? What if a single Hail Mary you murmur while walking, tired, distracted, or distressed, becomes the thread that pulls a soul out of darkness into the light? Father Pio believed this with such conviction that even those closest to him felt uneasy, because he didn't believe it was just a theory, but something he had seen happen in the invisible world time and again. He warned that people seek extraordinary prayers while overlooking the extraordinary power hidden within the simplest prayers, and he said that this blindness is one of the great spiritual losses of our time. For him, the Hail Mary prayer was not a gentle devotional habit or a comforting repetition learned in childhood, but a living power capable of shaking heaven itself. He once said with trembling conviction that if humanity truly understood the power contained in a single Hail Mary prayer, churches would never be silent and no soul would be forgotten. This belief did not come from books or theology, but from encounters that left a deep mark on his heart, moments when heaven allowed him to witness what happens when a seemingly insignificant prayer on earth reaches eternity. Father Pio lived amidst suffering, confession, blood, weariness, and a relentless spiritual battle. But of all the miracles and visions he witnessed, nothing astonished him more than the fact that salvation often comes not through great deeds, but through a small prayer offered with love. He often said that heaven moves quietly, not violently, and that grace prefers to come to the world through humility rather than ostentation. The Hail Mary, he explained, is humility spoken aloud, the voice of a child calling for its mother. He believed that the Virgin Mary does not listen to flowery words but to faith, and that the shortest prayer, when offered sincerely, becomes irresistible to her heart. This belief shaped the rhythm of his entire life. He prayed the Hail Mary while walking through corridors, while waiting between confessions, while bleeding from the sacred wound, when almost unable to stand from exhaustion. To those who wondered why he repeated the same prayer, he simply replied that each repetition was a new act of love, and love, he said, is never repeated in vain. The mystery began to unfold to others one quiet evening as he prayed alone before the Blessed Sacrament, motionless, immersed in silence. A monk, observing from afar, noticed a sudden change in his expression, as if sadness and joy were simultaneously reflected in his eyes. When Father Pio finally rose, tears streamed down his face, not tears of pain, but tears of overwhelming emotion. When asked what had happened, he replied that a soul had come to thank him, not for years of prayer, not for a novena, not for a mass, but simply for a prayer to Mary that he had long ago whispered and completely forgotten. Heaven, he said, had not forgotten. That moment shattered the common notion that small prayers would vanish into thin air. Father Pio explained that the soul was waiting not for extraordinary intercession, but for a drop of mercy, a crack through which grace could flow. That crack came through a prayer so small that the person praying didn't even remember having offered it. This revelation changed the way he spoke about prayer forever. He began warning people not to judge prayer by emotion, focus, or intensity, but by love. He emphasized that distracted but sincere prayers are often more powerful than perfectly focused prayers lacking humility. He said that the adoration of Mary works not because of our focus, but because of Mary's faithfulness. When a soul calls out her name, even in a moment of distraction she responds. He described her as a mother who doesn't analyze the quality of the cry before responding, but runs to it instinctively. That is why, he said, the adoration of Mary reaches places no other prayer can reach. It enters into moments of fear, panic, weakness, and despair where longer prayers cannot take shape. It becomes the last lifeline thrown to souls slipping into darkness. Bishop Pio believed that many people are saved not because they lived heroic spiritual lives, but because someone, somewhere, whispered a Marian prayer at the right time. He warned that pride blinds people to this truth, because pride wants to assume that salvation must be earned, calculated, and deserved. The Marian prayer shatters this illusion by revealing that salvation often comes as a pure gift. He said that this is why the devil hates small prayers, because they bypass pride and go straight to mercy. He often told his spiritual children that the Marian prayer has a double effect, uplifting both the person praying and the recipient of its grace. It purifies the heart of the speaker while opening a door to others. This double effect, he said, makes it one of the most dangerous prayers to the devil, because it silently multiplies grace. Bishop Pio also emphasized that the power of the Hail Mary prayer does not depend on the worthiness of the person praying. In fact, he said, sinners often unleash its power more freely than the righteous, because they pray without expectation, clinging only to mercy. He advised people not to wait until they feel holy to pray, because holiness is not a prerequisite for prayer, but prayer is the path to holiness. The Hail Mary prayer, he said, is the prayer of the weak, and therefore the prayer that God hears most quickly. He also warned against the temptation to disregard childhood prayers. Many, he said, will be astonished in eternity to discover that the prayers they whispered as children, without understanding their meaning, became decisive moments of grace for the souls they loved. Heaven holds these prayers like seeds, patiently waiting for the right time to sow the seeds of life. This understanding filled Father Pio with awe and urgency. He realized that every moment carried eternal weight. He believed that no words spoken with love ever vanish, and that even the smallest prayer could be the turning point in a soul's destiny. For him, the Hail Mary was not a repetition, but salvation. Not a habit, but a relationship. Not a custom, but hope. And he wanted the world to know that when a person prays,